you ever wanted an example of the notion of unintended consequences, here you have it. The last thing the United States neoconservative foreign policy establishment desired was to strengthen Russia. They appear to have decided that Russia is the greatest problem in the world and that they would concentrate on weakening Russia. This is a major part not only of the war in Ukraine, but particularly of the economic side of it. The sanctions program aimed at stopping Europe's purchases of oil and gas from Russia. Russia provided the cheapest oil and gas that Europe could have found anywhere. Because of this affordability, European products had lower prices. They did not have to raise prices as much because they had access to inexpensive energy. This made the European economy successful, competitive, and able to export, with Germany, above all, as the engine of European growth through its exports. All of that was undermined when the sanctions took effect to weaken Russia. However, those sanctions did not work, and they failed for two reasons that will help everyone understand why BRICS is so important. The first reason is that Russia was able to turn to its BRICS partners with whom it had been developing relationships for many years. BRICS is not an organization formed last year or the year before. It is older, and Russia had cultivated relationships with India, China, South Africa, and Brazil in numerous ways. To make a complex story short and simple, these countries began purchasing Russian oil and gas. As a result, Russia emerged stronger. The second unintended consequence was that Russia strengthened itself by turning to BRICS, but it was a two-way arrangement. For India and China to buy Russia's oil and gas, they had to work out the economics of this enormous business, which was imposed on them by the sanctions levied by the United States and its G7 allies in Europe. Consequently, BRICS became better coordinated, more interdependent, and their economies became more intertwined. In the end, Russia and BRICS grew stronger, while the United States became less powerful and more isolated because of its own decisions regarding the war in Ukraine. This isolation of the United States is now deepening due to its decision to provide unilateral support to Israel. The unintended consequence of trying to isolate Russia has been the isolation of the United States itself. The world has changed, and the United States is denying this to its own detriment. China is coming closer to being an economic equivalent of the United States. Its alliance, now accounting for nearly half of the planet's population, is poised to overtake and surpass the United States, which represents only 4.5% of the world's population. The unique position of the United States as the dominant power emerging from World War II could not possibly have lasted forever. It was a delusion to imagine it could. What is happening now is the foreseeable reality. The rest of the world has caught up, has figured out how to grow quickly, and is surpassing the United States. This should have been planned for, but it was not. It should have been understood, but it was not. It should have been discussed and debated in the United States, but it was not. I leave it to you all to understand that there is virtually no discussion of what is likely the most critical economic issue facing this country. How do we cope with, work with, and live with the decline of the American empire, the decline of American capitalism, and the rise of other capitalist and economic systems around the world? That is the issue we face. Denial, such as treating the BRICS conference in Russia as if it were merely a Russian event or all about Mr. Putin, is misguided. It was not, and it is not. This is the same denial. You cannot see what is happening because you rewrite it as the old Cold War struggle of the United States versus Russia. This is not only tiresome, but also leads to catastrophic mistakes, such as the war in Iraq, the policies in the Middle East, and indeed, everything else coming down the line. As long as one of the two superpowers pretends it is not one of two superpowers, it is both pathetic and dangerous to watch. The economic growth of the United States for this year is projected to be 2.8%. Keep that figure in mind, 2.8% growth, which is faster than any other G7 country. Now, let us compare that to Russia. Their economic growth rate, according to the International Monetary Fund, a Western institution dominated by the G7, is 3.9% for 2024. Next, let us turn to China, which is at 4.8%, almost double the economic growth rate of the United States this year. Then we come to India, with a growth rate of 7%, nearly triple that of the United States. I would not highlight these numbers for a single year if they were not consistent with the trends we have seen for decades. That is why China is where it is today. It caught up. They grew faster and figured out how to raise their people's standard of living more quickly than anyone before. This is not an endorsement of the Chinese economy or society, nor a suggestion that they do not have many problems. They do, as all countries do. But when it comes to economic growth, that is their strength. And it makes a difference in the world economy. To pretend this is not happening or that it does not indicate where the future lies is misguided. Of course, they have good humor among themselves at their conference. They are the growing dynamic core of the world economy now, while the West is not, and that is not about to change. That is why you must come to terms with it rather than pretend such situations do not exist or that it is all about Mr. Putin. It is not. Let me remind you of another statistic. The GDP of the United States remains the largest in the world, at somewhere between 25 and $30 trillion annually. That is the legacy of being the dominant economy for the last century. In contrast, what is the GDP of Russia, our so-called enemy? It is $2 to $3 trillion. People should understand that Russia has never been an economic threat to the United States. It cannot be. It is too small. It may have a powerful military, but economically, it is not a threat at all. The United States could, if it worked out an arrangement, easily come to terms with an economy so much smaller. The Chinese economy, however, is a different matter entirely. Their GDP is around $17 to $18 trillion and catching up. When you add Russia, China, India, and Brazil together, you get the powerhouse that BRICS represents. The path forward with continued denial is a path toward making mistakes. At the beginning of the war in 2022, there were predictions from the president on down that Russia would be destroyed, that it would fall to its knees, that the ruble would collapse, that Russia would be dismembered, and that Putin would be ousted. None of that happened. Why? Because they did not understand BRICS, what it meant, what it could do, and how it could intervene with Russia to change the outcome. More such mistakes are coming if you continue to pretend that we are in some old Cold War 2.0 rather than a new economic reality. As an American citizen, born here, living and working here all my life, I understand that it is very hard to be in the period of decline of an empire. It was undoubtedly hard for the British, who lost their empire a century ago, and for the Dutch, Persians, Greeks, and Romans before them. However, we have the benefit of knowing this history and can make choices to accept it, understand it, and work out a live and let live arrangement with the rest of the world. Otherwise, the doom and gloom predictions of World War III in all its forms will overtake us, not because they must happen or are built into the system, but because a population facing the decline of its empire and system chooses to deny it rather than address it in the mature way it should. At the end of World War II, the United States had experienced bombs falling on its territory only once, at Pearl Harbor. Never again did such damage occur. No explosions, no invasions, none of it. We lost some troops, but far fewer than other countries. Meanwhile, all potential competitors of the United States, Germany, Japan, the losers of World War II, and even Britain, France, and Italy, were devastated. Their factories were bombed, their railroads wrecked, and so on. As a result, the United States emerged in a unique position and held that dominance for most of the second half of the 20th century, when we could do almost anything we wanted. It did not matter. We were so dominant. The economic system here helped others rebuild from the war in Japan and Western Europe, and we could act as we pleased. This fostered the notion that we were alone in the world, that everyone had to adjust to us. That era is over, and it will not work anymore. I will explain why these tariffs are a mistake, as they assume the United States is still in the position it held before, where it could impose tariffs without suffering consequences. That is completely incorrect. Let me provide an example. Electric freight vehicles. They are the vehicles of the future. Due to the damage to our health and the planet's resource base, burning fossil fuels to power cars and trucks is on the way out. It will not be replaced by the rational choice of mass transportation, but by the irrational yet profitable decision to substitute electric vehicles for fossil fuel vehicles. Given this reality, here is the situation. Over the last 15 years, the Chinese, along with Europeans and Americans, worked to produce a profitable electric vehicle. The Chinese, particularly a company called BYD, have won this competition. If you are unaware of BYD, that is a sign of denying what is happening in the world, as the mass media have not informed you about it. BYD produces the highest quality, lowest priced electric cars and trucks. They are selling them worldwide, including in Europe. However, you will not find these vehicles on U.S. roads today. Why? Because there is currently a 100% tariff. This means that if a car costs $30,000 to bring in from China, you and I would have to pay $60,000 to buy it. $30,000 to the Chinese manufacturer and $30,000 to the U.S. government as a tax. Here is what this means, my fellow Americans. All over the world, every company that produces goods competing with American products, whether shirts, food, software, or anything else, needs cars and trucks for their business. They will buy the best quality, cheapest electric trucks, which will allow them to offer lower prices for their products. In contrast, Americans, who must pay far more for electric trucks due to the tariff, will charge higher prices for their products compared to foreign competitors, and they will lose business. As a result, you and I will lose jobs. Why? Because of the tariff. This may sound appealing, and it may seem like a tough stance, but it is a misguided political game that will ultimately harm us. After World War II, the dollar became virtually universally recognized as the global currency, essentially taking on the role once played by the British pound in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Central banks in nearly every country held reserves of gold and dollars to support their own currencies, leading to the famous phrase, "The dollar is as good as gold." Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing countries adopted a program of selling oil worldwide to any buyer, but only in dollars, then parking those dollars in New York City banks or U.S. treasuries. This became a focal point with enormous benefits. For example, the United States could pay for goods and services produced worldwide, French wine, Japanese computers, and so on, by sending dollars. Unlike other countries, those dollars did not return to buy goods and services here. They were held because they were valuable to hold. For 50 years, the United States consumed the world's produce in exchange for green pieces of paper, our currency, which costs us nothing and is intrinsically worth nothing. The benefits of this were incalculable. You cannot explain American economic well-being over the last 70 years without the dollar's role. That era is over. Today, central banks worldwide hold only about 50% of their reserves in dollars, compared to 80 or 90% as recently as 20 years ago. The symbolic and financial implications of this are enormous. Let me provide another example. The United States supports Israel in Gaza, one of the few countries to do so. Out of 195 countries in the United Nations, 146 have recognized Palestine as a state, just as they recognize Israel, the United States, or France as states. The United States and its allies are among the few still supporting Israel. Last week, Spain, Norway, and Ireland joined the list of countries recognizing Palestine. The United States is Israel's only significant supporter. Even other countries that have not yet recognized Palestine offer only nominal support at best. Germany may be an exception due to its history of perpetrating a genocide against Jewish people. However, the decision by President Biden following Israel's invasion of Gaza to provide 100% support was unnecessary. He is so entrenched in the way the world was that he does not understand that the Palestinians have won the global battle against Israel. Right now, ships cannot pass through the Red Sea or the Suez Canal because the Houthis, in solidarity with the Palestinians, have made it impossible. This has enormous effects on world trade and shipping. Every Arab and Muslim country and beyond, representing roughly half the world, is exploring ways to support Palestine. Turkey, for example, has halted trade with Israel, partly for this reason, as stated by its leader. My heart goes out to the Israelis as well, as they, alongside the United States, are miscalculating how the world has changed. This will impact Israel, which lacks the resources to cope even more severely than it is already affecting the United States. How valuable is NATO when 3 of its members, Ireland, Norway, and Spain, decided last week, despite heavy U.S. pressure, to recognize the Palestinian state? In itself, this is a small step, but symbolically, it is enormous. It demonstrates disagreement with the United States on one of the central geopolitical conflicts in the world, and they are doing so publicly. The reason this happened is that the leaders of these countries know what Americans are reluctant to face. The overwhelming majority of people in those countries support the Palestinians, not the Israelis, in the Gaza conflict. Their politicians acted not out of sympathy for the Palestinians, but to protect their own political positions. Inflation means that prices are generally rising, not all at the same rate, and some may even fall, but the overall direction is upward. That is all inflation means. The next question is, who determines prices? The answer is employers. If you are an employee, you have never been called into a room to set prices. That is done by the boss, the corporate board of directors, or top managers, a tiny group of people. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, employers make up 3% of our population. The other 97% are not employers. There is no democracy in inflation. A small, unelected group controls the prices we all pay. Inflation occurs when employers decide to raise prices, and they do so for the same reason they do everything else, to maximize profits. That is what makes a business successful. Thus, inflation is a profit-driven phenomenon that hurts the majority, who must pay more for what they previously got for less, while it benefits profits, because that is why it is done. When we experience inflation, as the United States has over the last 2 years, we turn to an institution designed for this purpose: the Federal Reserve, our central bank. According to its charter, one of its tasks is to maintain price stability. When inflation occurs, it is clear the Federal Reserve has failed in one of its primary objectives. So, what does the Federal Reserve do? In the last 2 years, it has raised interest rates. For most people, this makes a bad situation worse. In addition to rising prices for breakfast cereal, haircuts, or software, we now pay more on credit card balances because interest rates have increased. This solution exacerbates the problem. It is not the only option, yet the Federal Reserve's actions bypassed what should have been a debate. How do we address the inflation imposed by the employer class? We might recall that a conservative Republican, Richard Nixon, on August 15, 1971, confronted an inflation and announced on television that any company raising prices would face arrest and imprisonment, as would any union attempting to raise wages. He declared what became known as a wage price freeze. Did it stop inflation immediately? Yes, very quickly. Did it raise interest rates? Number. It was an alternative policy. Yet, we live in a country that not only did not pursue this approach, but acted as if no alternative existed. We have experience with this tool to combat inflation, but we live in a country that cannot face most of its economic problems because they serve as distractions from these critical issues. A few years ago, we faced shortages. We could not get toilet paper or medicines. We have shortages now. The most common explanation for past shortages was supply chain disruptions, a euphemism for shortages. I can show you shortages across various sectors nearly every year since 1971. To attribute shortages to wage price controls, you would need to demonstrate that shortages were more prevalent during those controls than in years without them. Every policy has strengths and weaknesses. I would not argue that a wage price freeze was problem-free, particularly regarding shortages. The more significant issue at the time was escapism. Corporations hired expensive lawyers and lobbyists to secure exemptions from the freeze for their firm or industry, leading to misallocations. Interest rate increases also have strengths and weaknesses. One weakness is that elevated interest rates have not prevented our inflation. We are still grappling with inflation, with as many predicting price increases as price declines. Interest rates are not a magic bullet. They hurt many while benefiting others, particularly larger companies less affected by rate hikes. The reason we have central banks, including the Federal Reserve, established at the beginning of the 20th century was that leaving interest rates to the free market led to dangerous volatility that threatened the system's stability. We introduced regulators to address the ineffectiveness and dangers of an unregulated market. However, we do not function well without a central bank, nor do we function perfectly with one. This is a contradiction not resolved by oscillating between the two. Pretending that a central bank will solve all problems when you lack one is as misguided as responding to a central bank's failures by praising the free market. Neither works perfectly. The Federal Reserve's anxious meetings over the past few years, where the top news is whether they raised interest rates, by how much or not at all, reflect a small degree of democracy. The public's pressure makes it difficult for politicians to ignore the issue. If we eliminated the boss in the workplace, the system would not collapse. We would not dissolve, and the world would not end. Instead, we could collectively learn to make decisions about what to produce, how to produce it, where to produce it, and what to do with the revenue. This would provide a foundation for democracy in our economic system, offering a better chance at broader democracy than we have now. These are all signs of a declining empire. This society understands in some way that the convenient oscillation of the past 70 years, alternating between Democratic and Republican presidents with similar patterns in the Senate and House, makes little difference. The differences are sufficient that half the population does not bother voting, seeing no point in it. They do not regret not voting because 2 or 4 years later, they still do not vote.